Welcome back. Today I'm going to talk through servicing the rear suspension and linkage on my 2000 DRZ400S. On my bike, the rear shock is also leaking, so I'm going to be replacing it with one off eBay. After putting the bike on a pit stand and removing the rear wheel, I'm working on removing the lower part of the linkage. Before starting this, I made sure to have replacement bearings for the shock pivot, just in case, as well as replacement bearings for the swing arm. What's great is since the DRZ had such a long run with no changes, the bearings are interchangeable from the 2000 model and even all the way up to the 2024 model. After removing the two pivot bolts and the lever arm, you'll notice that the swing arm drops a little bit. Off screen, I added a bungee to hold it just to make it easier to work in that area. I'm now loosening the lower bolt that holds the shock onto the linkage. Then I can get to work removing the top bolt from the linkage. Now this one is a little bit annoying to get to, and it is also torqued pretty tight. What helped me here was to put the pipe extension on a ratchet because my whole breaker bar couldn't fit in that tight space. After a bunch of struggling and swearing, I eventually got it off. This was not a fun bolt to remove, so I definitely would recommend planning a little bit of extra time when doing this one for the first time. After removing that top bolt, I can remove the linkage to see how it is. Before doing so, however, I want to remove the rear shock. However, here I make a little bit of a mistake because I remove that top bolt before removing the exhaust. If you're doing this yourself, I strongly recommend removing the exhaust first, so that like that when you liberate that top bolt from the shock, you can just pop the shock off. In my case, I had to put a little Allen key to hold the shock in place while I removed the exhaust. After removing that lower linkage and that exhaust, it was relatively easy to maneuver the shock out of the way. You'll notice that that shock has a nifty blue spring that is a Racetech aftermarket spring. I'm very happy to have it, however, it's not correct for my weight. So the replacement shock that I'm going to be using simply has the stock spring on it because it's correct for my weight. At this stage, since so much of the bike has been crusty so far, I decided to do my due diligence and remove the swing arm in order to check out the swing arm bearings. This is also penance for all the other times I told myself I was going to check swing arm bearings on my other bikes and did not do it because it is mad annoying. In the case of this DRZ, I'm really glad I got to it because the swing arm pivot bolt was seized inside of its bore. I managed to remove the swing arm nut okay, but pushing the swing arm bolt out was a bit of a challenge. Trying to pound it out using the hammer's handle didn't really go anywhere, but where I really started seeing results was using a pin and just hitting it with the hammer very hard. Yet again, we see the hammer's supremacy to work on any sort of vehicle or problem. You can see how dry and crusty that pivot bolt is. This should have some form of grease or anti-seize on it, and I believe that since the year 2000 it has not seen any. After removing the swing arm, I'm putting it on the bench alongside with the linkage in order to clean it a little bit. The goal here isn't to make it shiny, it's just to ensure that there is no dirt when we are going to be cleaning and greasing the bearings. The good news is that the bearings themselves seem to be in pretty good shape even though they are pretty dry. So what I'm doing is hitting them with some contact cleaner in order to clean out the remnants of the old grease. Now there really wasn't a lot, but I want to make sure when greasing the bearings again that they are nice and clean. I'm then going to add some fresh marine grease to the bearings in order to make sure they are nice and protected. You really want to use waterproof grease for all of these bearings because they're low down on the bike, and let's imagine you hit a water crossing or a big ass puddle, you want to make sure that the grease stays in place. During this whole process, I'm making sure to rotate the bearings a lot in order to feel for any moment where they might not be smooth. I'm then repeating the cleaning process for the bearing that is on the bottom of the swing arm that connects to the linkage. I'm honestly quite surprised to see in what good shape these bearings have been. Now, yes, they definitely were super dry, but they seem to rotate freely and have no binding, so maybe they were replaced before? I don't know, but it's a cool little surprise. After seeing how the rest of the bike was in disrepair, I'm glad I didn't have to replace these bearings. It's now time to clean and re-grease the suspension linkage bearings. Be mindful that the top bearing might lose its rollers all over the place. So here it was really useful for me to have a magnet on hand so that I could grab all of them and put them in a separate place. Once removed, it was really easy to clean them, and it was a little bit harder to put them all back. In my case, I found it pretty useful to put a dab of grease on the bearing cage before reinstalling the bearing needles one by one. The rest of the linkage bearings were also in fairly good shape, so I didn't need to press them out or replace them. I could simply just clean them with contact cleaner, make sure that they were nice, clean and dry, and then re-grease them with some fresh marine grease. I'm getting ready to reinstall everything on the bike, so I'm going to be coating the pivot bolt with anti-seize. If you don't have anti-seize, a little bit of grease is also good as well. And yes, I am aware that I used entirely too much anti-seize on that. All that's left for me to do is to reinstall everything in the opposite order of disassembly. When reinstalling the swing arm, make sure that you have the chain in the correct position and that everything is lined up so that you can insert the pivot directly in. The rubber mallet comes into handy here in order to push the pivot in. At this stage, I'm putting the swing arm pivot bolt back on, but I'm not torquing it quite yet. After the swing arm is back in, I'm dropping in my new-to-me shock from eBay and attaching the top bolt of the shock to the subframe. We'll make sure to fully torque it later once everything is connected, but for now, let's put back the linkage and put the lower bolt of the shock into the linkage. When reinstalling the linkage bolts, I'm putting a thin coat of anti-seize on them to make sure that they don't risk seizing into the linkage. Once all of the bolts are in, I'm ready to torque up all the bolts. I'll be putting up the torque values on the screen for you to follow along. Once the swing arm bolt is back, it's time to just put the rear wheel back on, put the exhaust back on, and send it. I still have a couple of odds and ends to take care of with this DRZ, but it's mostly ready to ride. Thanks for coming along on the journey to rebuild this DRZ. I'll see you on the road.